네, 감사합니다. 감사합니다. So, when I was a student 40 years ago in college, I could never have imagined that one day I would be giving a lecture in Korea, let alone at KAIST. So what I want to tell you about today is my journey in science, and some of the roads not taken, maybe some I should have, some I didn't, and how I ended up as a professor and as a scientist. So many of us throughout our lives, especially when we enter college, have a number of questions that we ask ourselves. What will I be? How will I get there? Where am I going? Some of you have already looked at my website or other websites of various professors and various professionals, and you look at a curriculum vitae or resume. And you'll see a list of what I call endpoints, where I got my bachelor's degree, master's, PhD, where I did postdoctoral work, where I was an assistant professor for the first time. So those are endpoints, but I think what's more interesting and what we've heard about today are the journeys that people take. And so there's certain turning points in my life which actually influenced my journey in science and my ultimately coming to KAIST to be a professor here. So what I want to describe are 10 turning points that influenced where I am today, sitting right here giving you a talk. So my first turning point occurred in 1974 when I was a third-year undergraduate student. Like many students in college, I started out with fantasies of being a medical doctor as a pre-med student. And during my third year in college, I kind of lost interest in passion and drive to be a medical doctor. So I actually withdrew from school, and I came home that winter break, and my parents said, well, what are you going to do if you leave school? I said, I'm going to be trying research. I think I want to be a research scientist. And my father, in his very gentle and understanding way, said, well, you've never worked in a laboratory before. I said, yeah, I know, I want to try it. So that was probably one of the most important turning points in my life, because I did the experiment. And the experimental result was fantastic. I said, wow, this is really fun and interesting. I want to be a scientist. So then, with that experience in mind, I decided that I wanted to undergo further studies to become a research scientist. So the next key turning point in my life occurred when I least expected it. Before I started my PhD studies, I happened to write to a scientist in the Netherlands, Dick van Beckham, who was the director of an institute, and asked if I could work there. And he actually agreed for me to come to his laboratory for the summer. At that point, I really hadn't thought carefully about the differences between basic science and applied science and clinical science. And so what started out to be my first of many trips overseas and abroad, I worked at an institute, the Radiobiological Institute, and it completely changed how I thought about my PhD studies. In that laboratory, they had both applied research and basic research. The applied research was trying to do experimental treatments of leukemia, and back in 1976, there wasn't very good treatments for leukemia, let alone any cancer. And the other part of the laboratory was studying basic biology of stem cells, which I was working on. And it was then and there that I began to understand that in order to really understand a problem, you had to understand the basics of that problem. So to solve the problems of treating human disease effectively, what you really had to do is figure out what was the molecular basis of human disease. So my next great turning point occurred when I went to graduate school, and I had an amazing PhD advisor, J.F. Kuo. My PhD was in pharmacology. It was studying biochemistry, and he was a great mentor. Believe it or not, I spent almost 4 years of my life isolating a single protein from pig liver until it was a single protein in the test tube, and I studied its physical and catalytic properties. But what this experience taught me, not only how to do science, but also the limitations of a single approach. And these days, everyone's talking about convergent technology in almost any area of science and engineering. So I had done my PhD in pharmacology, I had really done biochemistry, but there was many, many different approaches out there that one could use to begin to understand human disease. And I decided that I wanted to become a molecular biologist and learn molecular biology. Because in the early 80s, it was just actually the beginning of the whole revolution in understanding genes, gene function, being able to study genes. So my fourth turning point occurred in 1982 when I obtained a postdoctoral position at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory is one of the foremost research institutes in the world, and at the time I really didn't know that much about it. And my advisor was somewhat surprised that I decided to work at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory because I had the opportunity to work with Nobel Prize laureates, with members of the National Academy of Sciences, and I chose to work for two scientists that were just a couple of years older than me. They were just 2 or 3 years beyond their postdoc themselves. And it turned out to be an amazing experience. And I want to relate one example of what I worked on when I was a postdoctoral fellow. So as a postdoc, my first project was actually to express a eukaryotic gene, an animal gene, in bacteria. Back in the early 80s, it wasn't fully accepted that you could actually express eukaryotic proteins or animal proteins in bacterial systems. And so I learned two things from this experience. One was I was part of a team of 4 different scientists, which were each independent scientists. So it taught me the importance of teamwork in getting expertise from the right individuals. And it also taught me that sometimes when people say something can't be done, it can be done. So to make a long story short, this ended up resulting in a new methodology where in fact we said, wow, we detected a protein expressed in bacteria using antibodies to find the gene encoding the protein. But more importantly, that was something that at the time people said couldn't be done. There was also a scientist there that gave me maybe my most memorable compliment, and he said to me, David, you're too stupid to know why things don't work, so you try them anyway. So I think there's a lot of examples out there where scientists and other people that are creative were told, don't try that, it won't work. But somehow, when you try things, even though it may not seem like a good idea, you may be able to get the right experiment to work. My next turning point was something I didn't expect, and that was that I was promoted to the staff there as an assistant professor in 1985. And there was many great scientists that were at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, and two I want to mention. One is Jim Watson, who many of you know, Watson and Crick, who discovered jointly the structure of DNA. And I still remember to this day, Jim Watson called me into his office, gave me the letter of appointment, and said, oh, David, there's one mistake in the letter. We're not going to pay you $34,000 a year. We're actually going to pay you $36,000 a year. And I just looked at Jim and I said, Jim, it doesn't matter. I don't care. I said, I like working in the laboratory so much, you don't have to pay me anything. Well, they couldn't do that. That would set a bad precedent, right? But one thing we've heard throughout this conference is find something you love and work on it, and you'll be rewarded greatly. The other person who I got to know really well was Barbara McClintock. Some of you know Barbara McClintock. She did pioneering work in maize genetics and discovered transposable elements. Well, Barbara taught me two things, and yes, I did have completely black hair at one point in my life. So Barbara taught me one was to be a good listener. So after she died, about a year later at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, they had a big kind of celebration of her life. I suggested have a celebration. Don't have a memorial service. And many scientists came to speak about Barbara. And they all said how she had these mystical powers, how she was endowed with some great force that allowed her to make these great discoveries. Well, I knew Barbara both as a scientific colleague and as a friend. And she was the most amazing listener in the world. And she taught me the importance of listening, both to your experiments and to what other people say. And the other thing she taught me, which was equally important, was to believe in your ideas, because for many years she was basically ignored in the scientific community. And it wasn't until years later when she won the Nobel Prize that people started asking her about her work and if she was bitter about it. And she said, oh no, it's fine, I knew what I had discovered. So those were truly great lessons that I learned from Barbara. I also had the opportunity to travel around the world while I was at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory and visit many, many countries, which is a great fringe benefit of being in academia and being a scientist. So people asked me many times, even when I was in my early 30s, how long I would stay at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. And I always said that, well, I'm not sure, but I know by the time I turn 50, I'm going to leave. So yes, believe it or not, I am the oldest speaker at this conference. So that brings me to another point, which, I'm sorry. Before that, I did a sabbatical. And this is one other point I want to make. And that's that learning is a lifelong process, and even scientists need to be students throughout their lives, always learning. So I had the fortune of going to Zurich, Switzerland at the ETH, which is the equivalent of KAIST in Switzerland, and also going to the Weizmann Institute of Science. And those were great experiences, expanded my learning potential. And one thing I find as a scientist is that you're basically a student every day of your life. Okay, so this is the seventh turning point in my life, and that was finding a faculty position. So I knew by the time I turned 50 I would leave Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, and so I was recruited to the University of Miami, at first to be chairman of a department of cell biology. And I said to myself after my third interview that, well, I don't think I really want to be a chairman. But almost immediately, after I withdrew my name for consideration, the director of the Cancer Center called me and said, would you be interested in directing and developing a new graduate program in cancer biology? And I thought this was a great opportunity to build something from the ground up, which we all love to do when we have that opportunity. So when I got to the university, I've outlined this plan that I presented to the faculty, and what it involved was the combination of basic and clinical science, where the basic scientists would teach students, and also oncologists would also be part of the training of the graduate students. So this was kind of unheard of because usually at a medical school, the basic science departments are quite isolated from the clinical departments. And many of my PhD colleagues said, David, you'll never get a medical doctor interested in teaching graduate students. Well, it turned out I was right, they were wrong, and the program became one of the most successful at the University of Miami. And more importantly, I think the students are now getting both training by clinical oncologists and also PhDs. So another critical point in my life was meeting my future wife. And that brings me to the eighth turning point in my life. So as you might have guessed by looking at the slide, I happened to marry a woman from Korea, Lee Ju-young, who I met almost as soon as I started working at the University of Miami. And she's going to kill me for saying this, and she's in the audience, but on our third date, she actually turned to me and said, I want to have your children. Now, most men would go like, Apayo, I'm leaving, right? But I said, okay, that sounds like a good plan. Well, that brings me to turning point number 8, having a family. So we have 2 wonderful children, and one of them is Alexander, the other one is Nikolai. And so this is a picture of them. And so the big question all parents have, even we have as adults, is what will we be when we grow up? So of course you wonder like, well, what's Alexander going to be and what Nikolai is going to be? And if you look closely, you can see that Nikolai at his chotto actually grabbed a microscope. So I don't have to worry what he's going to be. And Alexander has already told me he wants to be a paleontologist. So I don't have to worry, I know what they're going to do. But having children, we had them both in America. I talked to Ju-young and I said it would be really great if we were to move to Korea and they would learn their culture. And so the next big turning point in my life was to find a job in Korea. So finding a job here. So I happened to be lucky that being a program director of a cancer biology program, every year I went to a conference of program directors and other scientists. And I happened to meet a scientist who was a graduate of KAIST. And she said to me, when I told her that we were thinking of moving to Korea, she says, why don't you apply to KAIST? And I was like, KAIST? What is KAIST? I didn't know, BNAO. So anyway, it turned out that I read about it and I said, wow, it looks really good. And I wrote to KAIST, and KAIST actually offered me a position. And so my turning point 10 in my life was in 2009. We moved our family to Daejeon, and now I'm a professor in the Department of Biological Science. And I must tell you that the best thing about KAIST are the students. So a couple of things I want to share with you about my thoughts on becoming a scientist. And I think it's illustrative of anything you want to do in life, whether it's in the arts, humanities, engineering, music, etc. A scientist should be the happiest of men or people, because these days many scientists are women. This was a famous quote by George Wald. I think anything you find in life should give you happiness and joy. And you shouldn't pick something for any other reason than you actually have a passion for it. So why consider a career in science? So I've listed a few pros, right? Amazing opportunities. You're contributing to society. It's challenging, creative, stimulating, dynamic, exploration of the unknown. You have international opportunities. You know, as a scientist, you can go anywhere in the world and work, even KAIST if you're an American. And there's great social interactions. But like anything, there are some cons. And I'll get to this. So some people say, well, there's limited academic positions. Well, there are and there aren't. Not everybody in science has to become a professor. Not everybody wants to be a professor. Many people want to go to a company. Many people want to work for the government. Many people want to do journalism, scientific writing. Some people complain that, well, there's funding sources, that it's difficult to get research grants. Well, it's true. And like anything in life, there's no guarantee of success. But I'm reminded of a character in Chinese, in that in life, sometimes everything isn't easy, and sometimes the worst things in life aren't always the worst. So in my life, what I've always found is that the worst situation or the crisis always gave rise to the best opportunities in my life. And I think that's one theme that we've heard about today. That crisis and opportunity can be one and the same. And just because something may seem to be hard doesn't mean you shouldn't try to do it. So I know time is going short, and I should talk quickly. So there's this famous story about the rabbit and the turtle, in that the turtle says, well, why do you make fun of me, rabbit? I can be fast. And the rabbit says, you're just a turtle, you're very slow. So you all know the story that the rabbit challenges the turtle to a race. During the race, the rabbit gets distracted, he falls asleep, and the turtle actually wins the race. And that brings me to one of my favorite quotes from Francis Bacon: the very haste with which you go will make you lose your way. So I think people should take time in their lives, they should take time to think of what they're doing, take time to think about the journey they're taking, and if sometimes it seems a little hard and isn't going as fast as you want it to be, that's okay. And so I'll leave you with one final thought, and that's, during your journey, whatever you seek, may you find, and whatever you find, may it bring you happiness and contentment. Thank you. 감사합니다.